The reason for this talk on unity and diversity in the Middle East is a number of years ago when I was lecturing about aspects of the Middle East, I happened to mention the Iraq-Iran War. The Iraq-Iran War was a horrible war. It lasted over 8 years. It was widely known that there were a number of different kinds of atrocities on both sides, the using of gas on the opponents, using child soldiers, especially to clear minefields, and all kinds of horrible things on both sides. Well, I talked about that war a little bit, and then a woman at the end in the question time, she said, well, why are the Iraqis and the Iranians fighting each other? They're the same. They have the same religion, they have the same history, they're all Arabs, they speak the same language. Why are they fighting each other? And I went, oh, you really don't have a clue. The Iraqis and Iranians are completely different. The Iraqis are Arab in their background. The Iranians are Persian. They're not Arabs. The Iranians are Shia Muslims. They're almost over 90% Shia. While there was a Shia majority in the population, it was the Sunni that was in control of Iraq. Saddam Hussein was Sunni, and his Sunni Ba'ath Party ran the country. So they were fighting over religious issues. And they don't speak the same language. They speak Arabic primarily in Iraq. In Persia, or Iran, they speak Persian, or Farsi is the more modern name for it, but it's the ancient Persian language updated. There are huge differences. Well, that sort of alerted me, and I since have experienced this in quite a few ways, that people really do not understand the extent of diversity and of very complicated kinds of relationships in the Middle East. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. I used this map before to identify the fact that the Middle East, and we're right here, I think, right now, the Middle East has long been seen as sort of the center of the world. This is an old, very old French map, and this is an ancient German sort of metaphorical map, not literal, that shows the three great population centers at that time of Europe, Asia, and Africa, all of them being joined by the Middle East. This is particularly Jerusalem, but the idea of the Middle East being in there. Well, if you think about it, the idea that Africa, Asia, and Europe all see this as the crossroads, and this has been the path that has been taken in between these major population centers for thousands of years, then it makes sense you'd have a whole lot of different kind of people here, wouldn't it? Because you've got people coming from all different directions, all different backgrounds. So we want to talk about that a little bit. This is, I haven't shown you this map before, but I've shown you something comparable. This is known as the Levant. This is the Fertile Crescent. And when we talk about the Middle East, this is unity and diversity in the Middle East, what exactly are we talking about? In ancient times, they would talk about the ancient Near East. And usually when they did, they meant this basic area here. The area of Mesopotamia, of the Levant, and of Egypt. Today, when we talk about the Middle East, we usually are talking about 17 particular countries. This is the pretty much universal definition of Middle East. It includes the countries of Bahrain, Cyprus, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. And you're going to be visiting 4 of those 17 on this trip and sailing around a whole bunch more of them. So this is usually what is meant by the Middle East. Now, depending upon what the topic is, what it is they're talking about, the relationships, whether it's the oil of the Middle East or the Arabic influence of the Middle East, sometimes they will add additional countries. There are 9 additional countries. In Asia, they sometimes will add Armenia, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, which of course are over here. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, etc. Sometimes they will include in Africa, Sudan, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Libya. Again, depending upon what they're talking about. So whether you say 17 or 26, this is what we mean when we talk about the Middle East. Again, in ancient times, I don't think I even explained this when I did Faith and Culture in the A&E, or Ancient Near East. This used to be what they called the Ancient Near East. And it was the Near East, at that point, because the point of reference was primarily from Athens or even from Constantinople. So this was near at that point, as opposed to the Far East, which would have been China and the various other countries of Asia. Later on, when the point of reference moved further west into Western Europe, whether it be Rome or the other areas of Western Europe, all of a sudden this was no longer the Near East, it was the Middle East, and the areas of Eastern Europe were the Near East. So, and the reference to the Middle East, which we think of as this area today, that's a relatively new term. It was only quoted in the early 20th century by an American, by a U.S. naval officer who was doing a survey of the various powers here, and he was the first one to use the term Middle East. Before the 20th century, it was always called the ancient Near East. But today, while this dark green is the ancient Near East, we would include all of this, at the very least, as being part of the Middle East, and some other countries as well, just to sort of give you a perspective of what we're looking at there. Now, we've talked about the various empires that came from this area, the empires from Mesopotamia, like Sumeria, Akkadia, Assyria, Babylonia, the Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, Ptolemaic Egyptian. This is the area that has generated so many of the great empires of history. It is the place where language was first developed, the place where cultivated crops and domesticated animals, irrigation, so many other things came from this area. This is very much the center of the cradle of human, there are humans other than Americans, of human experience. There are only 2 times in history when the majority of this area was controlled by one power. It's always been split up except for 2 times. Once was under the Islamic rule. Again, I've shown this map before. The dark orange is the area that was conquered under Muhammad himself. The lighter, sort of yellow color, is where the Rashidun, the next 4 of the caliphs, and I'll explain all that tomorrow when we talk about understanding Islam. The next 4 caliphs, caliph means successor, those who followed after Muhammad, they conquered the yellow area, and then the green area here, and then over into Afghanistan, Pakistan, Baluchistan, etc. That was a result of the first caliphate after the Rashidun caliphs, the 5th caliphate, which was the Umayyad. So at this point, virtually all of the Middle East, with the exception of Asia Minor, which was later taken over by the Seljuk Turks, was controlled by the Muslim armies that came out of Arabia. The second time that it was controlled by one power was the Ottoman Empire, again the Muslim Empire, but later on taken over by people from Turkey and elsewhere. And they controlled not only the areas we think of as the Middle East, including all of Anatolia, which we know of as Turkey, but even all of Eastern Europe. Again, for a lot of years, they were right outside the gates of Vienna. And all of these countries, Bulgaria, Romania, even Greece, Wallachia, Hungary, they were all under Muslim control for a very, very long time. These are the only 2 empires that had ever been able to control all, or almost all, of what we call the Middle East. There were 2 other times when they almost did it, and that was under Alexander the Great and under the Roman Empire. But Alexander the Great was not interested in anything in the Arabian Peninsula. Rome didn't get any further because of the Parthians, didn't get any further than about here. So there were parts of the Middle East that they were not able to control. But again, very different periods of history, very different kind of control, different cultural influences, etc. Now, many people, when they think of the Middle East, they think Arab. Just like the woman that said that, the Iraqis and the Iranians are both Arab peoples, why do they fight? The fact is, the definition today for Arab is anyone who has Arabic as their as their first language. For a long time before we had genetic testing, the only way we could really trace where people had come from was through their language. And so we think in terms of people being grouped by languages. Almost all of Europe, with the exception perhaps of Hungary and Finland, which have very weird little languages, almost unique in themselves. But most of Western Europe come from Proto-Indo-European languages, or PIE, which came from India. That's the Indo part, and then moved further west. So languages were the way for a long time before we had genetic testing. That was the only way we could really try to identify where people had come from. Now we obviously can go into genetics and we can identify the various genetic markers that we have that tell us whether we came from say Jewish roots or whether we came from Western Europe or further east or whatever. How many of you have had your genetics done to tell you where you come from? Were you surprised? I pretty much knew. I'm about as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant as you can get, so it was all Northwestern Europe. But some people have been shocked to find out the extent to which they had Native American roots or the extent to which they had various other kinds of things. So it's a fascinating thing to do. But in terms of this Middle East being Arabic, which a lot of people think, when they talk about the Middle East, they think Arab. 3 of the 6 largest economies, if you want to define, and 2 of them are 2 of the largest population areas in the Middle East, do not have Arabic roots and do not speak Arabic as their first language. And those are, the largest economy in the Middle East is Turkey. The people there are Turkic. They speak a Turkic language. Now, Arabic is used because Arabic is the religious language of Islam. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. The Muslim faith says that Arabic is the language of God, literally, that God speaks Arabic. And that the Quran is written in Arabic because it has always eternally existed in Arabic. In fact, the Quran, the holy book of Islam, if it's translated into another language, it's no longer considered the Quran. It's considered a commentary on the Quran. True Quran is only in Arabic. So any Islamic country will have Arabic. You're expected to learn some Arabic in order to be able to be conversant with your faith, in order to be able to read the Quran, etc. But again, Turkey, the biggest economy and one of the largest population areas in the Middle East, is not Arab and does not have Arabic as their primary language. The second biggest economy is Iran. And as I've already said, Iran is not Arabic. They are Persian and they speak Persian. But they are an Islamic country. And then the 6th largest economy in this whole region, does anybody know what it is? Israel. Okay. The 3rd biggest is Saudi Arabia, the 4th is Egypt, the 5th is Iraq, and the 6th is Israel. Clearly, Israel is not Arabic in its ancestry, didn't come from the Arab peoples. It's a Semitic people, but not an Arabic people. And they don't speak Arabic. They speak Hebrew. So 3 of the top 6 economies and 2 of the largest population areas in the whole of the Middle East have no connection to Arabic history or the Arabic language, other than the countries that are Islamic will use it as their religious language, but it's not the everyday language. A lot of people are shocked by that. In addition, and so one of the things that's happened for a long time, people in the Arab world have talked about a pan-Arab or the pan-Arabic kind of country. When I talk about Lawrence of Arabia, I'll talk about the huge deceit that the British and the French foisted on the Arabic peoples by promising them they would have an Arabic nation that would include all of Saudi Arabia, all the way up to the edge of Turkey, etc. They then just broke their promise outright, and we'll discuss that. But one of the problems when you start talking about a pan-Arabic nation or pan-Arabic movement is exactly what I just said, that some of the largest population areas are not Arabic. The Turkish people, the Iranian people, and certainly the Israelis would have nothing to do with a pan-Arab focus because of the differences that they have. When we talk about ethnicities, again, Turkey, Israel is the 6th, and then Iran, huge population area and a large economy. When we start talking about languages, again, Arabic is spoken as the religious language, but there are so many different languages spoken in this area. While Arabic is one of the largest, we have a lot of other languages: Turkish, Farsi, Turkmen, Uzbek, Kazakh, Azari, Luri, etc. There are all kinds of other languages that come into it. In fact, the top 5 languages in the Middle East are Arabic, and then Persian or Farsi, Turkish, Berber, and Kurdish. But there are about 50 languages spoken in the area we consider the Middle East, 20 of them are considered major language groups. And so the idea that they would be connected by language simply doesn't fit. Let me know if this starts breaking out, cutting out so much you can't hear me, all right? And again, back to the issue of ethnicity, while a lot of people think of it as being an Arabic center, in this area there are Arabs, Armenians, Assyrians, Azeris, Balaks, Bengalis, Circassians, Copts, Crimean Tatars, Druze, Filipinos, a large population of Filipinos who work in, for instance, the United Arab Emirates and elsewhere, Greeks, Hindus, Jews, Kurds, Lurs, Maltese, Mandaeans, Maronites, Pakistanis, Pashtuns, Persians, Romas, Samaritans, Shabaks, Sikhs, Sikhis, Somalis, Tats, Turks, Turkomans, Yazidis, and Zazas. They're not all Arabs. In fact, 16 of those groups I just mentioned list population groups in the millions. 16 of those different that I just listed, and I intentionally was trying to be a little overwhelming by reading this long list. Some of them are very small. For instance, there are Samaritans still in the world. You know, the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament and the references to the Samaritans. There are only about 800 Samaritans left in the world, but they are a distinct people group, and they have to be acknowledged. They're not just like everybody else. When we talk about Arabic being a dominant language, and it is the largest language, there's Arabic and then there's Arabic. This color coding gives you all the different kinds of Arabic that are spoken. This list here is 22 different kinds of Arabic. Gulf Arabic, Bahariat Arabic, Naja Arabic, Omani Arabic, Hijazi Arabic, Libyan Arabic, and so on. You think they're all the same? Frequently, they don't understand one another very well. Our guide in Rames, our friend, by the way, when we talk about everybody being Islamic, I don't know if you picked up, Rames is a Presbyterian. He calls me pastor because we're both Presbyterians. And so we're Facebook friends with him, and we've known him for several years now. He's invited us to his wedding in May, so we hope we can come back to Cairo for that. But so you've got a wide variety, but he talked about the fact that in language, that when people speak Arabic with a Lebanese accent, that's considered, it's like we might respond to a really beautiful English accent speaking the English language. He said that somebody from Egypt really can't understand somebody from Saudi Arabia, even though they're both speaking Arabic. And so we run into very great differences. There is not a unified sense of them all speaking the same language, even if they're speaking Arabic. One of the other complications is you'll notice this jumble of different colors. They don't follow any national lines. The geopolitical lines that divide countries have nothing to do with either the ethnic backgrounds of people or the language background of people, which is one of the things that often leads to conflict, because people that are historically not friends with one another, don't speak the same language, don't have the same belief systems, may get pushed together in one country because they don't take that sort of thing into account very often when they do country divisions. Or, on the other hand, tribal groups that speak the same language and have the same history and the same ethnic background sometimes get divided. They get separated and belong to two different nationalities because of that. And that complicates things, as you can well imagine. So it's very difficult to draw too many general conclusions with regard to language, ethnicity, or any of the rest of that. Again, back to this chart, Arabic being a dominant language, but some of these, like Turkish and Farsi, are completely different roots, in no way associated. In fact, two of the languages that are closely associated would be Hebrew and Arabic, the language of the Jewish people and the language of the Arabic people, because they are both Semitic languages. Jews and Arabs are cousins to one another. When I talk about the idea that they've always hated each other, they've never gotten along, is simply not true. And I'll get into that in some of the future lectures, all right? We also get into the question about religion. Obviously, the dominant religion in this region is Islam, without a question. 90% of the people that live in the Middle East are Islamic. But do you know what percentage of the total Muslim world lives in the Middle East? Anybody?
Not a majority.
What's that? Only 20%. 80% of the Muslims in the world do not live in the Middle East. The largest Islamic country in the world? Indonesia. You've all heard that one. And so the idea that Islam, that this is where, maybe where Islam started, but there are very different ideas about the religions in this place. About 90% of the area is Islamic. About 5% is Christian. It used to be almost 20%. That number is changing radically for two primary reasons. Again, as I said earlier in a lecture, not because of conversions, but because the Muslim nations tend to have a much higher birth rate. And secondly, because there has been so much upheaval and so many problems in the region, the Christians tended to be better off. For instance, the Christian Palestinians. The Palestinians, there used to be a huge contingent of Christian Palestinians, but they tended to be better off than some of the Islamic Palestinians, and so many of them, given all the troubles in that region, they have left. They've immigrated to another country. So between a higher birth rate amongst the Muslims and a high attrition rate in terms of immigration out of the region by Christians, we've seen a drop from 20% in the early 20th century to only about 5% now. And there's some idea that that may drop much lower even by 2020 or so. And then we also have Judaism. About 1.6% of the people in the region are Jewish. But even that doesn't really give the picture. Because when you talk about Islam, the difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam is fundamentally critical to understanding what goes on in this region. Why is it in Yemen, you had to talk this morning about Yemen, why in Yemen are there Shia rebels fighting the Sunni government, and the Shia rebels are being supported from Iran, and the Sunni government is being supported by Saudi Arabia? The Shia and the Sunni, the two major parties, Sunni is almost 90% of Islam, but Shia and Sunni, I don't want to say they all hate each other, but they have long-term conflicts. Imagine what it would be like if the Baptists and the Methodists were trying to kill each other in your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. This is very much what the experience is in many areas between the Sunni and Shia. And we'll talk about the differences a little bit when we get into talking about understanding Islam. They really do see one another as heretical. Many of the more militant Sunnis in the Salafi movement or Wahhabism, which is in Saudi Arabia, or the much more some of the conservative Shia, they feel so strongly that the others are heretics, they consider it more, they have more of a problem with other Muslims that they consider heretical Muslims than they do with Christians or Jews. And most people don't get that. But in addition to these three religions, there are a lot of other religions. In this particular region, we have the Baha'i faith, which is considered a heretical version by Muslims of Islam. I'll talk about that if you're continuing on to
Singapore.
Where do we go? Singapore. You'll hear a lecture that will include that. If not, then you can check it out on the videos later on when we get those all uploaded. But the eight-pointed star is representative of the Baha'i faith, or nine-pointed star. The five-pointed star are the Druze, again, a heretical offshoot of Islam. We have the Yazidis. The Yazidis have been in the news quite a bit because they were terribly oppressed, persecuted, and just outright murdered by ISIL, or ISIS, depending on how you want to call it. We also have the Mandean religion, which has been around for most of 2,000 years. There is Zoroastrianism, and then there is Buddhism. All of these have fairly significant populations in the areas. And there are a lot of others: Gnosticism, Yazardism, Samaritanism, Shabakism, Ishkaism, etc., etc. It is not easy to identify one movement. Just like because so many people aren't from an Arab ethnicity and they don't speak Arabic, they have not supported a pan-Arabic movement, that is getting all the Arabs together in one nationality or one group, because they have, even within Islam, they talk about a pan-Islamic movement. Shias and Sunnis don't get along. And those aren't the only two kinds of Islam either. You're going to be visiting Oman. Oman is predominantly Ibadi Islam. They have a very different idea about the Quran, and they have a very different understanding of some of the Islamic principles in the Hadith and Sunnah, and I'll be telling you about those things. You also have the Alawite movement, which came out of the Shiite belief. The Syrian president is Alawite, for instance, but he relates more to the Shiites than he does to the Sunni. It's very complicated. But you get an idea, it's not as simple as, oh, they're all the same, why can't they get along? Another significant thing that has happened was the effects at the end of the First World War. We will talk about this quite a bit more when we get into Lawrence of Arabia and what happened in that time. Again, I'm not going to go through the battlefield scenarios of what happened in the First World War, but we are going to talk about all the political and activity that went around that and the results of it, the long-term results of that. But in 1914, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of what we consider the Middle East. At one point, they controlled all of it. That, when, as I showed you, they were one of only 2 empires that ever controlled all of the Middle East. But they had shrunken. They were the sick old man of Europe, and I said before, they made the mistake of joining as an ally with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. And so after the war ended, they broke this area. In fact, the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk, that I'll talk about in a minute, he kept Turkey together as a nation. But the rest of the Ottoman Empire got broken up. They declared their independence. The French were here. All of this area were controlled by the British. That's called the French and British Mandates. But all of these countries eventually were able to declare their independence. Turkey in 1923, Lebanon 43, Egypt in 22, Yemen in 1918 toward the end of the war, or right after the end of the war, Kuwait in 1961, Mesopotamia, which became Iraq in 1932, etc. And so eventually they became independent nations. But they had all been part of one empire before. Well, the idea of creating a nation where one didn't exist before, where do you draw the lines? Who gets included? Who gets excluded? As I said, this has been a source of a lot of real problems and concerns as well. And we will get into that a little bit more later on. One thing I want to mention, because I talked about it, I referred to it before, and I'll bring the same slide up when we talk about Lawrence of Arabia. The Hashemite rulers in Arabia, before it was Saudi Arabia. Saudi is named for a family, the family Saud. But before it was just Arabia. The area along the west coast of Arabia is called the Hijaz, and it is where Mecca and Medina are located, the holy cities of Islam. Well, the British were very smart when for the First World War, when they were trying to get the Arabs to rise up and revolt against the Ottomans. Remember, Ottomans aren't Arab, but they controlled all this area, and the Arabs didn't like the fact that they were being ruled over by somebody who was not of the same ethnicity as them. So they approached the king of the Hijaz, the man, he was the emir at first. Emir means prince. They later named him king. His name is Hussein bin Ali. This is him in all of his dignity. He was the Sharif of Mecca, the emir of the Hijaz, and later became the king of the Hijaz. He is the one that decided they would join with the Allies, particularly with the British, to try to cast off the Ottoman Empire. And it was he that agreed that they would work with the British and with Lawrence of Arabia particularly. He had 4 sons. The 4th youngest one doesn't really account for much. He's not even up here on my pictures. The oldest one was Ali bin Hussein. After his father died, he became the king of the Hijaz, but just for about 1 year before they were conquered by the family Saud. The second son, Abdullah bin al-Hussein, was first the emir and then the king of Jordan for 30 years. It is still called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. You remember that? We talked about it. In fact, you will notice on the Jordanian flag and on a lot of the other, well, some of the other flags in the region, there is a red triangle built as part of the flag. That red triangle represents the Hashemite families. And so the Jordanian flag is the Hashemite kingdom. It has that red triangle. It also has a white star in the triangle, which represents the Arab uprising. But the most important of the sons was the third one, Faisal bin Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi, or Faisal. He was the one that was the primary warrior. He is the one that fought with Lawrence of Arabia. He became the king of Syria in 1920, and the French, because they had been promised Syria in by the Treaty of Paris, the French marched in and threw him out. They literally marched in with an army, and they tried to resist, but they were not in a position to fight against the French army. And so the French threw him out. They just took it over in order to take advantage of the oil. He later, I think that the British began to feel kind of bad about all of that, and so the British later made him the king of Iraq. He was the king of Iraq for about 12 years, and because Iraq was part of the British mandate. And so for that period of time, and this is obviously later on, they had a Shah in Iran, Iraq. They had a king in Iraq till 33, and then it all broke down after that. They ended up with dictators like Saddam Hussein. But this family, we'll talk about a little bit later on when we talk about Lawrence of Arabia, were a major moving force. As you can see, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, all from this one family, the Hashemite family. This guy, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, his real name has got like 20 other words in it. He was the guy who controlled the center part of Arabia. He conquered Riyadh and the area around that called the Najd. And then in the 20s, after the First World War, he marched over and conquered the Hijaz, the area that have Mecca and Medina in it, and threw out the Hashemite ruler, the oldest son of the emir that we saw right there. And he took over all of the northern part of Arabia. Not Yemen, not Oman. That part stayed independent. But he controlled all of that, and he named the country Saudi Arabia because his family name is Saud. Abdulaziz ibn Saud. In the 1930s, he was the king when they found oil. He was the one that really, made them a power in the Middle East and a world power in terms of their oil control. He was quite the medieval character. He loved to ride in on a horse with a sword and fight battles and everything else. He had dozens of wives. He had many children. He had 45 sons. You wonder why it is almost everybody you hear about in the news from Saudi Arabia is Prince such and such, because he had 45 sons, and everyone that is descended from those 45 sons in the family Saud are all princes. There's only one crown prince, the guy who's going to become king, but all of them are princes. And he is the one that controlled all of Arabia and made it a world power. And he did it partly because of a relationship he had with this very conservative Islamic teacher, Wahhab. And so today, Saudi Arabia has perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most conservative kinds of Islam. They just gave women the right to drive. That's the new crown prince is trying to liberalize things. The Wahhabistic beliefs in Saudi Arabia are some of the most conservative, and to women at least, the most oppressive anywhere in the world. And yet we don't talk about that a whole lot because they're an ally of the United States. But they are very, very ultra-conservative. The other guy I want to just mention quickly is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He is the founder of modern Turkey. He is the one, after the Ottoman Empire fell, he had been a soldier in the Ottoman army. In fact, he was leading the forces in the Battle of Gallipoli, that the British and the Allied forces were defeated so badly. He was in charge of the Ottoman troops there. After the war, the treaty in Paris said, we are going to break all of the Ottoman Empire up and we're going to split Turkey up. And he said, no, you're not. And he put together an army from the soldiers that were still in Turkey. He defeated, and not everybody got involved in this, the British were not involved in others, but he defeated the army that marched into Turkey to try to split them up. Let me try this other one. Okay, let's try this one. And so he defeated the army and insisted that Turkey, what used to be Anatolia, would be one nation. And then he fundamentally changed the whole country. He understood that in order to be a viable nation, they had to relate to the West, not the East. And so he changed the alphabet so that people in the West, could at least transliterate it. He changed the way people dressed. He got rid of the traditional Arabic and Islamic, or Turkic and Islamic clothing. He created schools. He provided free and mandatory primary education. He gave rights to women that they had not had any rights before. He fundamentally changed that culture. And in the 1930s, the parliament that he had created awarded him the name Ataturk as a surname. Ataturk means the father of the Turks, and the law says that no one else can ever have that name. He's an astonishing man in terms of what he did in Turkey. And despite the recent problems that Turkey has had because of their current president, Erdogan, Turkey has a phenomenal success story. They produce all the food they need. They're rich in natural resources. They're a huge economic power. Remember, number one in all of this region. A book that I read that you might be interested in is called The Next 100 Years. It says that the United States will continue to be the world power because of our Navy. We have the most powerful, by far, blue water Navy. But that two other countries by the year 2100 will grow to global influence. Those two countries are Turkey and Mexico. Mexico, because it has access to the two great seas, and all significant amounts of material that travel in the world travel by sea. Having access to the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, which only the US, Mexico, and Canada have, and then the Central American countries, which are just small, is a very significant thing. So Turkey, if they can get rid of some of the weirdness they've got right now, but then who are we to talk about weirdness that we've got right now, right? And so here's what we're talking about when we talk about the Middle East. The part of the world that we are in, that you are getting to see, the cradle of civilization where so much of human culture developed, but it is a very, very complicated region. So don't be fooled, as many people are, into thinking that this is all just one thing, one people, one language, one faith. It's much more complex than that. We'll talk about some of the religious stuff tomorrow when I talk about understanding Islam, and then we'll pick up bits and pieces of the history as we go along in some other talks. Any questions?
I have one.
Yes.
You said that with all the dialects that you have in the language, the countries can't understand each other, but is the written word the same in all of them?
Yeah, the difference in the languages is how they pronounce it. But like the Quran, since the third of the Rashidun caliphs, Uthman, he was the one that solidified that this is the text of the Quran, and it's never been changed since then. In fact, you may hear this if you go to Oman, like in Serene Salala, you'll visit the Sultan's mosque, and they may say to you that unlike the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, no one has ever messed with the Quran. It's exactly the way it originally was, and it has been for all eternity. Well, it was 20 years before they finally finalized it, so, and there are a couple of mistakes in it that you don't want to mention to somebody who's Muslim, okay? Anyway, but yeah, it is written the same, but then they pronounce it differently. And it's just like somebody from the deep south and somebody from New Jersey trying to talk to one another. They may be able to eke out basic understanding, but they're not going to be able to understand some of the subtleties, even though they're speaking the same language. Or somebody who's Cockney speaking a language. Now, they have the same written language as somebody who's from New York, but what?
Yeah.
What? You get a lot of that. And the same thing happens in Arabic. Other questions? Yes, right here first, and then back there.
Wondering about, people have been talking about how many Muslims are strongly Muslim as opposed to a more nominal, less concerned form of
Right.
Islam. In what country?
How many radical Muslims exist? How many militant Muslims?
Or how many are relatively calm about?
Right. All of the best scholarly estimates that are reasoned estimates say that more than 95% of all Muslims practice their faith and want peace. They are not interested in creating, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, they're not interested in creating a problem. Less than 5% are militant, or that are Islamists, is what you call it, that are either Wahhabists or a radical version of it, that feel that they have an obligation. and people quote verses out of context from the Quran, and I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow afternoon. I can quote you verses, I'm a Christian minister. I can quote you verses from the Christian Bible that, taken out of context, give me permission to do all sorts of things. Any witches in here? I have a responsibility to burn you. Anybody have a daughter that's disobedient? You need to have her killed. All right? That's in the Bible. So we need to be very careful when we take the Quran or writings from any other religion out of context and then claim that it says something general about that faith, when you can do the same thing to us. And they say, well, look at all the atrocities that have been committed. I'm sorry, but do you remember Jim Jones in Guyana? Do you remember David Koresh in Texas? The Branch Davidians? How many times have we done that?
Well, our government did that in Texas, so I don't think that's...
Well, but the idea of you could get into, was it justified, etc., but there was evidence that there were underage children that were being given as wives and all kinds of things like that. So there are a lot, we need to be more humble before we start poking somebody else in the eye about stuff. Back there, yes?
Oops, he's gone.
Good luck.
He's gone. Maybe we'll say the question was.